Hello and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we're going to be looking at my Formula One iceberg. This video is something that I've wanted to do for a while, and over the last few days I've been compiling all of my own research into the weird and wonderful history of Formula One. Now I do know there are at least 2 or 3 other Formula One icebergs out on YouTube, however I believe that this one does cover some unique subjects which the others don't. And with that in mind, I'd like to issue a quick disclaimer. Some of the topics discussed in this video may be distressing to some viewers. No footage in this video depicts any fatalities out of respect, however some images are suggestive of the outcome of some incidents, with some photos taking moments before tragedy. I will however go into detail on what happened in each instance, which can include injury detail, mentions of death and other triggering topics such as sexual assault. The first few tiers of this iceberg do not contain any distressing content, however when we do reach that stage, another notice will be given prior to getting into the more sensitive subjects. So with that out of the way, let's get straight into it. Since the inaugural season back in 1950, Formula One has come on a crazy journey. What started off as just car racing has now grown into something much more. With TV shows, paddock politics, and allegations of cheating left, right and centre, F1 is a sport like no other. And whilst it all does seem quite innocent on the surface, when you start to unravel the layers, you really do start to see how dark this sport really is. Throughout the history of the sport, however, there have been a lot of well-documented cases that even the most casual F1 fan will have heard of. However, you've not clicked on this video to hear about all the well-known cases and crashes and incidents. You're here to really get into the nitty-gritty when it comes to Formula One's dark, troubled past. While some of the more well-known cases will still be in this video, the nature of an iceberg is the deeper down you go, the darker things start to get. So, let's get into my Formula One iceberg. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on these early ones as these are very recent and very well known. However, I will break it down for those who do not know. Effectively, during the 2022 season, it was brought to light that Red Bull and Aston Martin had both breached the cost cap regulations, with Aston Martin being found guilty of a procedural breach and Red Bull Racing being found guilty of going over the budget cap altogether. With the idea of the budget cap in the first place being so that big teams can't just spend their way to success every season. The punishments just were not severe enough for these two teams, and as we head into the 2023 season, it's pretty clear that these two teams have made the biggest improvements, and I'll let you use your own initiative as to why. Coming off the back of an already controversial 2021 season, the FIA did say prior to the budget cap being installed that teams would be losing their titles if they broke the budget cap regulations. However, this has seemed to be more hot air from the FIA as Red Bull were rolled the red carpet out and allowed to keep their titles for the 2022 season. Now, Multi-21 is one of the more light-hearted entries into this iceberg, and unless your name's Mark Webber or Christian Horner, it's pretty funny. There is a good video that I will link down below in the description, but Multi-21 basically is a code that F1 teams give to their drivers and it orders them to stay in their positions. This is an example of team orders, and while team orders are frowned upon generally in Formula One, this one is more to save the tyres and make sure the drivers can drive more relaxed without damaging the vehicle potentially. However, in Malaysia in 2013, Sebastian Vettel just decided to go completely against this and overtook his rival Mark Webber and teammate to win the Grand Prix. This then led to the now famous clip of Mark Webber in the cool-down room after the race, shouting at Vettel, Multi-21 Seb. The video will be linked down below and it explains it better than I have. Now getting into another more light-hearted entry, this is the Rich Energy story. Effectively, William Storey founded this company in 2015 called Rich Energy, who sell energy drinks. Apparently they're the premium energy drink brand of the UK, although no one's ever seen them on a shelf in our country. And I say our country there because I can't speak on behalf of anyone else outside the UK. Has anyone else seen these? Let me know down below. And the man you're seeing on screen is William Storey. He looks like the lead from Nickelback has just been hit in the face by a grizzly bear. So anyway, his fake energy drink company Rich Energy managed to win the sponsorship rights to the Haas Formula One team, rebranding them to the Rich Energy Haas F1 team, and the sponsorship payment was never paid, effectively. The whole thing came crashing and burning down, and William Storey's perfect drinking empire just crumbled in the Formula One sense. However, weirdly enough, Rich Energy does continue to still sponsor different motorsport teams to this day. I will leave a link down below to some more content and resources regarding this guy, and you can do your own research, but I'm pretty sure if you know Formula One, you know the Rich Energy story. This should have probably swapped places with the rich energy scandal, but I'll put it here anyway. The Belgian 2021 Grand Prix, which is obviously quite recent, basically it was absolutely torrential rain and only 3 laps were ran, and these were all behind the safety car, with on the 3rd lap the red flag was flown, terminating the race completely. The FIA's next move was to wind up the 200,000 plus strong crowd at Spa de Francorchamps by completely terminating the race and not resuming. This gave us one of the strangest looking podiums of 2021, with 2/3 of it being pretty normal in the sense that Max and Lewis were sharing that podium almost every race, and stood on the P2 podium step was the Williams driver George Russell. As he had an incredible qualifying just the day before, putting that arguably the worst car on the grid at the time, the Williams, into P2, the points were effectively taken for the classification from qualifying, so he achieved his first career podium as a result of this fiasco. And you may be wondering what happened to all those 213,000 spectators who turned up in the pouring rain to go and watch nothing. Well, the answer to that is nothing. They didn't get a refund, no reimbursement, no sorry, no anything. So, nice move, FIA. Now, this one looks at the idea that there is a bias in Formula One, whether that's the heads of the sport themselves favouring some teams over others, it's up for debate, or whether that's the Sky Sports pundits having their own warped sort of views on drivers and incidents because of their favourites. I think a good example of this is Paul di Resta, who got, let's face it, he got his ass handed to him by Lewis Hamilton throughout all of his karting days and his junior motorsport career, and weirdly enough, when he's on the Sky cameras, he sort of has a negative opinion on anything that Lewis does. Whether it's intentional or not is up for your own interpretation, but it does lead me nicely into the next stage of the iceberg. Now, I need to quickly air my own biases here. I am a Lewis Hamilton fan. He is one of the most inspirational people on this planet to me, and I will forever look up to him. And seeing him hurt as he was on that day will stick with me for a long time. And the events that transpired on that day should never be forgotten. And now when I say that it should never be forgotten, I mean in the sense that going forward, we can never afford to have another mishap like that on the scale that it happened again in Formula One or sport as a whole. I'm sure if you're watching this as a Formula One fan, you know exactly what I'm talking about with Abu Dhabi, but if you don't know, basically Hamilton was leading the race, and going into this final race of the season, him and Verstappen were both level on points to the championship. Hamilton was clear of Verstappen and had the faster package on the day, and it was leading the race comfortably, set to secure a record-breaking 8th World Drivers' Championship. On lap 53 of the race, Nicholas Latifi crashed at turn 14 while battling Mick Schumacher, and this brought out a safety car. And with this, Hamilton stayed out, as he would have made no advantage by pitting for a fresh set of tyres. He'd have lost position and therefore lost the championship. However, Red Bull, with nothing to lose in case there was another racing lap, did box for the soft, faster tyres. Now behind the safety car, this was a gap of 5 cars between Lewis Hamilton in first and Verstappen in second. And under the safety car regulations, another lap has to be done behind the safety car to allow all cars to unlap. However, this is not the case. Only the cars between Lewis and Max were allowed to unlap themselves, even though they weren't even allowed to go full the way around the track. The race director, Michael Massey, then ordered the safety car peel into the pit lane to allow one racing lap between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen to decide the championship. Max was then able to pass Lewis on his way to winning his first World Championship in Formula One. However, in Formula One, the nature of a safety car restart, not even just to protect the order, but when it restarts, it allows the grid to be bunched up together, and the likes of Carlos Sainz or Yuki Tsunoda or Gasly, who were in the top 5 also, could have fought and potentially competed for a race victory or a podium, but they were robbed of the opportunity just because only the 5 cars between Max and Lewis were allowed to unlap themselves and no cars behind. You can see this quite clearly in the fact that Carlos Sainz finished 5 seconds behind Max and 3 seconds behind Lewis. So you could look at that and argue, had Sainz been allowed to race effectively, he could have potentially finished second or first. Anyway, I've spent quite a long time on this. Let's move on to the next one. I think it's almost impossible to cast your eye back on Formula One and not talk about the Formula One espionage controversy in 2007, also known as Spygate. So basically, in 2007, McLaren got their hands on information, highly confidential technical information regarding Ferrari, which they shouldn't have. There was around 780 pages of Ferrari documentation that was stolen, and he was photocopying in Woking when all of a sudden the guy that was the employee of the photocopying shop realised that they belonged to Ferrari and decided to contact the team to report him. This led to a whole blown investigation. Houses were raided, people were sacked, it was a mess. And as a result of this, McLaren were excluded from the 2007 Constructors' Championship altogether. McLaren were also fined $100 million, which to this day remains the largest fine ever issued in sporting history. And these punishments aren't just the most significant in Formula One, but sports as a whole. Then, to make matters more complicated, Renault's F1 team were summoned before the FIA's World Motorsport Council in regards to a charge of them having confidential information relating to McLaren. So yeah, the whole situation's just so messy. So I personally find this one fascinating. As part of a PR stunt during the 2004 Monaco Grand Prix, the Jaguar F1 team raced with $300,000 diamonds embedded into both of the nose cones of their two cars. And in this instalment of top 10 things that you do not want to happen, on the opening lap of the race, Christian Klein crashed his car and the diamond from the car went missing. Even after 20 years, nobody's quite sure whether it was just lost or it was stolen or whether the diamonds were even real in the first place and whether they were just a publicity stunt that didn't require the use of real diamonds. But anyway, it got people talking and it still has people talking to this day. So, in 2012, the Bahrain Grand Prix returned following the 2011 Bahrain Grand Prix being cancelled due to anti-government protests in the country. Despite a lot of threats in the area and a lot of heavy protests going on and a lot of violence, the race still went ahead, keeping in line with Formula One's "The Show Must Go On" theme. The whole thing was highly controversial, and The Independent even went on record as to name it one of the most controversial in the history of the sport. The race ended with Sebastian Vettel driving for Red Bull taking the victory. Now, Saudi Arabia in F1 is a topic all on its own, but I'll be as quick as I can whilst being as thorough as I can. To begin with, the human rights violations in Saudi Arabia are just unacceptable, and then all the workers that have allegedly died while building this track or trying to build it in a certain time frame, again, is just ridiculous. There were concerns that the race would even go ahead in 2021 because of the delays to the construction of the circuit itself. But the FIA managed to find a way somehow, nothing to do with money at all, to push a way through to make sure that the circuit was accredited and safe and had all the necessary certificates in time to host the race. Now, I'm going to use safe really loosely when referring to this track, as it is anything but safe. Drivers complain about the breakneck speeds at which they take blind corners on this circuit for quite a while now, and while work is being done to improve the sightlines around the track, it is still quite a dangerous circuit. We're doing this again. So, Haas, welcome back. Yeah, it's strange, obviously, how Haas end up in these weird situations with sponsors, but basically, Uralkali took over, owned by Dmitry Mazepin, with his son Nikita Mazepin taking on a driver's role in the team, and basically they rebranded the car with Russian flags, which Russian athletes in general cannot compete under their flag due to the doping scandals. Oh god, I bet you didn't expect to see this mug in the video. But obviously with the Ukrainian war and Daddy Mazepin having his fingers in all sorts of Russian pies, the team had to cancel the deal and reverted back to their traditional white and red colours. I do genuinely find it fascinating though how America's F1 team can proudly rock around with the Russian flag on its wings. Oh, Bernie, Bernie, Bernie. Where do we begin? Known as the F1 Supremo, as he was the ultimate owner of Formula One, he is a leech, basically. I'm sorry, I'm not going to beat around the bush here. He's a leech. From tax avoidance claims to claims of bribery. He's even expecting a child at the grand old age of 92. This guy is just weird. And some of the things he says, oh my god. For example, on the Ukrainian war, he said he'd take a bullet for Vladimir Putin, and he said he's still friends with him. He also referred to him as a first-class person. And if, like me, you believe in karma, well, 2 weeks after he said this, he was charged with tax fraud. And now for one of the craziest things you'll probably ever see in an F1 video on YouTube. Vladimir Putin and Adolf Hitler in the same video. Now, there is actually a valid reason for Hitler's inclusion in this, as in 2009, Eccleston went on to say that Hitler got things done. He was able to get things done. Wow. Can I assure you now, this is not Bernie Eccleston's only inclusion in this video, and all I'm going to say right now is, You're only as good as a company that you keep.
During the 1994 Formula One season, there were several allegations of cheating flying around the paddock, with the bulk of the allegations being targeted towards the Benetton F1 team, who had the driving pairing of Michael Schumacher and Jos Verstappen for that season. The allegations first came around in the first round of the 1994 season when Michael Schumacher came in for a very fast pit stop, and at the time the rivals were just left scratching their heads at how he managed to get out ahead of his then rival Senna. That season, Ayrton Senna famously opted not to return to the Williams pit lane after retiring from a Grand Prix and instead decided to sit back and watch the race from the sidelines, paying close attention to the Benetton cars and keeping an ear out to see if he could hear anything out of the ordinary. The Brazilian was convinced that Benetton were using an illegal traction control system, which gave them an unfair advantage. The whole situation then came to boiling point when allegations were renewed following Jos Verstappen's Benetton exploding in a fireball in the pit lane as a result of a refueling incident. The working theory from rival teams was that Benetton had a system in place that allowed them to fuel their car up quicker, enabling them to have faster pit stops. Subsequent investigations showed that this theory was correct and that they were using a fuel valve with no fuel filter, which allowed them to fuel the car up 12.5% faster than any other team on the grid. Overall, this is just another example that shows how far teams will go to push the rules, even if it means putting the health and safety of their drivers and staff at risk. Fortunately, the only thing that was harmed during this whole situation was Benetton's reputation.
The 2008 Singapore Grand Prix may seem innocent on the surface, but when you actually realise what transpired, it's pretty crazy. In a similar vein to the previous Benetton scandal, this is another example that shows just how far teams are willing to go to give their drivers success, even at the expense of people's welfare.
The Renault F1 team of that season consisted of the driver pairing of Fernando Alonso and Nelson Piquet Jr. And also tying into the bias section from before, Piquet Jr. did not have the best time here at this team underneath the team principal Flavio Briatore. With Alonso starting P15 on the grid, it was quite unlikely he'd be able to get a win from this race. However, on lap 14, team orders from the boss at Renault told Nelson Piquet Jr. to bin his car into the wall to bring out the safety car to allow Alonso to gain an advantage after he had just made his first pit stop of the race. And after making the advantage count, Alonso went on to win the Grand Prix. At the time, Piquet Jr. said it was a mistake, and it wouldn't be until a year later where he would admit that he was told to do what he did. Still to this day, Fernando Alonso defends his victory in Singapore in 2008. 2022's British Grand Prix was shocking for two reasons, which are kind of the same reason, but I'll explain how. Just moments after the British Grand Prix got underway in 2022, George Russell tagged the Alfa Romeo of Zhou Guanyu, and it caused a horror crash. The Alfa Romeo was flipped right upside down and was sent skidding and sliding across the gravel trap, across the tarmac, until it came to a halt embedded in the fence just below a spectating viewing paddock.
So the first way that this incident is shocking is just the accident itself. No one ever wants to see a Formula One car do that, and nobody wants to see it flying at speed towards a occupied area with spectators. And not being for the invention of the halo, we would have just been seeing Zhou's head dragging along the floor with nothing to support him at all.
Now, Zhou Guanyu's roll hoop did actually end up failing, which is shocking, and an FIA investigation did follow. Fortunately, more good came from this incident than bad, with Zhou Guanyu walking away unscathed and the roll hoop investigation concluding that it did fail and improvements have been made since.
The remainder of this video will discuss issues ranging from sexual assault to death, with some injury detail being shared. If any of these topics could trigger you, please leave the video. This is probably one of the most high-profile cases of racism in Formula One. Now, when you see the Hamilton family on this list without being aware, you might just think, I don't understand what the Hamilton family has to do with anything, or his brother, Nicholas, who actually is a racing driver himself despite having cerebral palsy, which is very inspirational. Instead, this is referring to the 2008 Spanish Grand Prix, where Formula One's only black driver was subject to disgusting racist abuse. Several spectators at the Spanish Grand Prix were donning blackface as well as wearing t-shirts that spelt out the Hamilton family. And on the back of the shirt saying Alonso #1. Now, instead of doing the right thing and calling out this abuse, Fernando Alonso did the complete opposite and basically blamed Lewis Hamilton for the abuse and said that it wasn't racism and it's just their way of making a joke. Alonso also went on to say that F1 didn't need to do an investigation and that this is just an isolated incident, also saying that there should be no anti-racism initiative in Formula One just as a result of this incident. Now, you may be confused as to why one of the most notorious and disgusting sex offenders of all time, Jeffrey Epstein, is on a Formula One Iceberg video. I'll get into it. Well documented that Epstein liked to surround himself with like-minded perverts on his island and elsewhere around the world, and his little black infamous book tells all about his little lifestyle. And given the riches in Formula One, it's no surprise that there are at least some names in there, including Lawrence Stroll, owner of Aston Martin, as well as, mentioned before, you're only as good as the company you keep, Bernie Ecclestone. Very, very interesting. The 2020 Bahrain Grand Prix is, in my opinion, since I've been watching Formula One, the biggest sigh of relief in the entire sport. On the opening lap of the race, Danny Kvyat's AlphaTauri tagged the back of Romain Grosjean's Haas, sending him into the barriers. Grosjean's car then split in half and set on fire. Marshals then ran to his aid and the TV cameras naturally pulled away as the red flag was flown. Miraculously, Romain Grosjean managed to climb out of the car and escape the blaze. This is one of the most insane things I've ever seen on TV live, and I hope it's never topped. It's also worth noting that it is universally agreed that the halo saved Grosjean's life, and without the invention of it, we probably would have lost him that day. At the 2022 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, the organisers decided to put the lives of all drivers, staff and spectators at risk just in the name of entertainment. A missile struck an Aramco plant which is around the corner from the circuit, which strangely enough has Aramco plastered all over it. First practice was marred with a big cloud of black smoke in the background, and second practice was delayed by 15 minutes to allow for an emergency meeting. However, at the end, Formula One decided that the Saudi Arabia Grand Prix would go ahead despite the looming threat of further missile strikes. Quite shocking in my opinion. Now, sticking with the theme of FIA incompetence in 2022, we have the Japanese Grand Prix. The Ferrari of Carlos Sainz found the barriers at a very wet Japanese Grand Prix with limited visibility. Tractors came out on track to get rid of the vehicle. However, to the surprise of the drivers, especially Pierre Gasly, the cars were still out on track while the tractor was on track, which is very dangerous. Pierre Gasly went on the radio to say that he could have killed himself, and he really isn't wrong, as around 8 years prior to this Grand Prix, we lost a driver from a very, very, very similar incident, and the father of the said driver, Jules Bianchi, was furious and said there was no respect for his late son. And he's not wrong. If Pierre Gasly had found himself embedded underneath that tractor, we'd probably be talking about a different incident right now. Now, you may be very, very, very confused as to why the Orange Army is on this list and so far down, but in my opinion, I think more conversations need to be had about the Orange Army and their behaviour. As recently as 2022, the Orange Army has shown themselves in a very negative light, and whilst I appreciate they are very passionate about their driver, Max Verstappen, they really do overstep the line. Drivers themselves have even asked them to stop with the over-the-top flare lighting, as it is obscuring vision and has previously stopped proceedings with a flare being thrown on the track last year. And they have a very Neanderthal-like mindset where anyone that isn't seen to be supporting their driver or supporting, what they see as the right, then you're going to be facing a whole world of issues such as racist abuse, homophobic abuse, and unfortunately even sexual abuse against fans of other drivers, with some women on Twitter complaining about being groped and handled inappropriately on Twitter at several races last season. They also have a habit of burning the merchandise of other teams, more specifically Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton, and Verstappen refuses to take any form of responsibility and tell his fans to stop, and he really does need to start doing this, otherwise it will just continue. We are literally seeing a herd of just vile people at Formula One races, and instead of stopping them, they're rolling out the red carpet and giving them huge grandstands to just go and mingle and cause all sorts of incidents. But instead of being properly challenged on the way they act and conduct themselves, teams such as Red Bull, well, I say teams, the only team, which is Red Bull, even give out appreciation posts to them. And Formula One as a sport glorifies the fan base. And while I do understand that they are very passionate and we need more of that in Formula One, these guys are really not the role model that the sport thinks they are. How long is it going to be before things start to get, physical with violence and somebody gets seriously hurt just for wearing a different driver's merchandise? Now, this is your final warning that this final tier does go into a lot of detail regarding death and injury, so if this could trigger you potentially and you haven't left the video yet, then this is your final warning. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway, often well known for having the Brickyard, is also quite infamous in Formula One. Now, for a start, I'm not here to talk about the 2005 Grand Prix here, as that was controversial for its own reasons. I'm here to talk about the wider track throughout its whole history hosting Formula One races. Between 1953 and 1959, this circuit took 7 lives, which is the most of any F1 track in history. The track opened in 1909 and was very popular, and is probably going to be quite a still popular track to a lot of people to this day, still hosting Indianapolis races. However, this newspaper clipping from way back then is quite chilling to read, and it just shows that this circuit is very, very, very dangerous. And this chilling line, "More may die," did actually come true on numerous occasions since this was published, and unfortunately this circuit has claimed many, many, many lives in motorsport. The Japanese Grand Prix in 2014 was the last time a driver lost their life as a result of injury sustained during a Formula One Grand Prix. Jules Bianchi, driving the Marussia car, sped into the back of a recovery vehicle which was dealing with another incident, and the picture you're currently seeing was taken seconds before that impact happened. I won't show the actual incident itself because I believe that would be in poor taste. The entire F1 community was left absolutely reeling from this devastating incident. However, the FIA themselves don't seem to have shown any remorse or have learned any lessons, as mentioned previously. Pierre Gasly nearly had a similar incident in the Japanese Grand Prix, which was just held in 2022. The 1970 Formula One World Drivers' Championship trophy was awarded in a way which we should never hope to ever see again. At the Italian Grand Prix in 1970, during practice, Jochen Rindt's Lotus flew into the barriers after a brake shaft failure, and with his seatbelt gripping tightly around his throat, he was pronounced dead on his way to the hospital. Rindt himself had previously raised safety concerns with the Lotus car, as it had been quite unreliable up until this point. Apart from the loss of life and the family that he left behind, the saddest part is that he went on to win the 1970 Formula One World Championship, as his closest rival in the standings could not accumulate enough points over the remainder of the season to dethrone the Austrian. He is affectionately known in Formula One as the Young Crown Champion. The Nürburgring, also known as the Green Hell, is one of Formula One's most infamous and most dangerous circuits. It was given its chilling nickname, the Green Hell, by Formula One's legendary driver, Sir Jackie Stewart. Jackie Stewart also said in an interview that before he left for the German Grand Prix, he would take one last look down his driveway because he knew that there was every chance he would not return home. Now, probably the most infamous incident at the Nürburgring was when Niki Lauda's car caught on fire during the second lap of the German Grand Prix in 1976. Niki Lauda himself, prior to the race, invited his other drivers to boycott the Grand Prix, mainly because he didn't feel like the organisers of the event had the resources to properly manage the Grand Prix at the circuit. Niki Lauda thankfully survived the incident, however he was left with serious burns which left him quite disfigured. Niki Lauda did continue racing in Formula One after this incident. In 2004, Jeremy Clarkson went on to say on Top Gear that he thinks the circuit has claimed at least 200 lives over the years. Countless documentaries have been made, and it is a very, very, very dangerous track which isn't actually raced on today in its entirety. To fully understand the tragedy of the Belgian Grand Prix of 1982, you have to go to the race immediately prior to this, at the San Marino Grand Prix, where quite a lot of context is. Gilles Villeneuve and Didier Pironi were 1-2 driving for Ferrari during the San Marino Grand Prix of 1982, while the team ordered both cars to slow down as the driver in third place was significantly further behind than the two, and they wanted to preserve the car. Villeneuve interpreted this as an order to maintain track position, however Pironi did not, and he took the opportunity to pass Villeneuve on the final lap. This really wound Villeneuve up to the point where he said he would never speak to Pironi again as long as he lived. Those chilling words from Villeneuve would come to head as 2 weeks later at the Belgian Grand Prix, the Canadian lost his life in the final qualifying session. Didier Pironi beat his qualifying lap by just 1/10, so Villeneuve went back out on track to set a faster time. In his eagerness to beat the driver who he felt had seriously wronged him just 2 weeks prior, he had a crash at around 140 miles an hour, went airborne and nosedived into some catch fencing. Villeneuve was catapulted from his airborne car and flew 50 metres further down from the wreckage, snapping his neck on a fence. Doctors who arrived at the scene found that he was not breathing but had a weak pulse. However, later that evening, he died as a result of a fatal fracture to the neck. We know that the Netflix series Drive to Survive shows that in Formula One, rivals will do anything to one-up their peers. However, on this occasion, in trying to do so, Villeneuve lost his life. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix marks what is probably one of the most tragic race weekends in Formula One history. Drivers, mechanics and spectators were all injured at this race, which proved to be a turning point in both the safety of Formula One and the development of the sport itself. The weekend nearly began in tragic fashion as driver for Jordan, Rubens Barrichello, hit a curb and went flying at around 140 miles an hour, launching him into the air as he hit a tyre barrier on his way down. He was knocked unconscious and apparently the impact was around 95 Gs. His car rolled several times before landing upside down. Medical teams came to the crash site and it seemed that he'd had a broken wrist, a broken nose and his tongue was blocking his airways, and it said that the work done by the FIA doctors on the day saved his life. When Barrichello regained consciousness, he recalls that Senna was the first thing he remembers seeing as he was there at the medical centre after selflessly parking up his car to come and check on him. The following day, tragedy struck. On the Saturday qualifying session, Austrian driver Roland Ratzenberger hit a concrete barrier head on. This resulted in him receiving a skull fracture, and later that afternoon, he unfortunately had lost his life. On the Sunday, during the race, the Brazilian Ayrton Senna lost his life as a result of his car not being able to turn while going at high speed, causing him to go straight into a concrete barrier at around 131 miles per hour, despite his best efforts to brake. As a result of this, Senna was killed instantly, with his steering wheel piercing his chest, as well as him receiving numerous other issues. Despite the loss of the three-time Formula One champion's life, one of the more tragic parts of this is that in Senna's car, they found an Austrian flag, which Senna had planned to raise after the race in honour of Roland Ratzenberger, who lost his life the day before the same circuit. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix will probably remain one of the most well-known tragedies in Formula One history. The 1977 South African Grand Prix had what, in my opinion, are some of the most disturbing images caught on the Formula One broadcast in history. On lap 22, a car pulled up to the left of the main straight opposite the pit wall. Two marshals then came running over to his aid. However, sadly, only one marshal made it across the track. The image you're seeing on your screen now is a still image just seconds prior to what I can only describe as shocking. The marshal that arrived first was William Bill, and the second, who sadly did not arrive, was Frederick Janssen van Veen, who was carrying a 40-pound fire extinguisher at the time. This is important context. He was running across the track when Tom Price, who was in 13th place, was driving at speed and could not move out of the way in time. He struck the 19-year-old marshal, splitting his body in half on impact, naturally killing him on impact. The images on the broadcast showed Van Veen's lifeless body being flung across the track, with both of the halves of his body barely being held together. Now, you may be wondering where the fire extinguisher comes in, as I did say it was important context. Well, sadly, Tom Price, the driver who struck Van Veen, lost his life also, as the 18-kilogram fire extinguisher struck him on the head, wrenching his helmet upwards, snapping his neck, killing him instantaneously. Sadly, Price's car, with him lifeless at the wheel, continued down the track, hitting another car, sending them both into a concrete barrier. Thankfully, the other driver was not injured, and Price's car then came to a stop. The body of the steward Janssen van Vern was actually only identified the day after the race director had summoned all of the race marshals, and he was not there. So that gives you an idea of how extensively mutilated his body was. Now, the Italian Grand Prix of 1961 is, from what I can find, the biggest single loss of life at any Formula One event. At the Grand Prix of his constructors team, Ferrari, Wolfgang von Trips lost control of his car after colliding with the Lotus of Jim Clark. He then crashed into a fence, killing 15 spectators as well as himself in the process. Also, the photographer of the images you're seeing on screen right now subsequently lost his life as the car barreled into him on its way into the crowd of spectators stood on the grass banking alongside the track. Wolfgang von Trips was actually in the title fight that season with his teammate Phil Hill, who went on to win the race. However, sadly, as a result of him losing his life here and his teammate winning the Grand Prix, Phil Hill won the title and Von Trips obviously could not challenge him. The race was also not immediately stopped afterwards. This was allegedly due to there was a potential panic amongst the crowd, which would have then jammed the roads around the track, making rescue work difficult for those with injuries. 16 people sadly lost their lives at this Grand Prix. And that brings an end to the iceberg. On your screen now is the iceberg in its entirety if you're interested in seeing all the different tiers and what goes into them. While some tier placements are up for discussion, I do think on the whole, the general gist is the further down you go, it gets a little more deep and things you might not actually fully know about, as well as obviously things that are shocking that have happened in Formula One as a sport. Does bring an end to the video. Thank you so much if you watched all the way through, or even if you just skipped to the latter stages to find out the darker parts about Formula One. I really appreciate you no matter how much of the video you've watched, as a lot of time and effort went into the research for this video as well as the actual filming and recording of the video. This took me maybe a week, so yeah, a lot of effort went into making this. I also want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been showing this channel a lot of support recently. The latest video at the time of recording got around 75k views, and we are nearly around 250 subscribers, which is mind-blowing. Thank you all so much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, leave a like and subscribe. I plan on doing a lot more Formula One related content going forward. If there's anything you think I've missed out or anything you want to discuss regarding this iceberg, join me down in the comments below. I'm very active down there and will happily discuss anything with anyone. Thanks again and see you in the next one. Take care.